I was raised Roman Catholic, but I was more casually Catholic, or what they call cafeteria Catholic, where you pick and choose the parts of the religion that you want to keep and leave the rest on the buffet. The parish was not the center of my community. My mother raised us, I guess, tangentially to the church. There was faith, but it was sort of an option. It was not an atmosphere where you were forced to breathe this life. I remember the smell of incense. I remember the weight of the kneelers, the way the light came through the stained glass windows on the occasional Sundays when we went to church. I've heard stories from relatives of the Easter that I cried during Mass because the men had been so mean to Jesus. I remember praying. I remember believing. I trusted in my mother's faith. But I was also a kid who liked to ask questions. And somewhere around 14, during my mandatory confirmation education, the questions started running out of answers. I wasn't exactly hostile in my questioning. I just wanted more details. I wanted to make my mind up for myself about the truth of all of this. You know, I had a philosopher's soul even back then. Why does God, who is all-powerful and all good, allow children to suffer? If Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor," why does the church own so much property and decorate it with gold and jewels? If pride is a sin, why does every institution in the faith seem organized around the question of who has authority over whom? How does the Adam and Eve or Noah of the Bible jive with modern genetic understandings of reproductive diversity and evolution? I really didn't want to reject my faith. I didn't want to reject it. I just wanted to take it seriously. I was looking right at it, like trying to see what it was. And it wasn't as beautiful as the people who ran it made it out to be. That distinction took me a long time to understand. I was too questioning to be a member of the laity, but I was also too sexual of a human being for the clergy. So I ended up where questioning people without institutional homes in the Catholic Church tend to end up: secular academic society. What I've come to understand after years of reading and thinking is this: the questions I was asking at 14 weren't meant to be attacks on Christianity or Catholicism itself. They were simply Christian questions. They are the questions of the tradition itself tends to raise, and then, far too often, tries to shut down. Churchy kids who actually read the Sermon on the Mount and then look at the American churches and think to themselves, wow, this doesn't really add up. Those are not the enemies of Christianity. That kid is almost certainly doing what Christ would have been asking of them. They are making Christianity possible. That kid is thinking like a Christian. I don't believe the church, Catholic or Protestant, was ever meant to be dogmatic. And yet, it's a sad observation that today, that's where most of them land. They're morally lame, overly performative, basically empty institutions. They're Christian in name, largely pagan in spirit. Welcome back to American Socrates. I'm Matt Rupert. Today's episode is not meant to be an attack on Christianity or really on any faith. I want to be explicit about that because what I'm going to try to cover today is going to be charged, and I don't want anyone to mishear what I'm doing. What I want to do today is a little bit of what guys like Dan McClellan and his data over dogma kind of take on religion and do. You know, I want to take the texts of the Bible seriously. I want to read them in a sort of historical context, and I want to ask honest questions about the philosophy behind them. What are they trying to tell us how to live our lives? And I also want to talk about what really gets done in the name of Christianity, especially in American public life, that really doesn't match any of that. So this gap, I think, is really important here. It's really significant. And I think looking into and questioning what people in the church do is not anti-Christian. I think, in fact, it is the very standard that the texts themselves demand of us. They want us to be self-reflective and self-critical. And so I am not a Catholic. In fact, I would not consider myself to be a Christian of any denomination. But still, I am going to invoke my inner Jesus here and try to do what Jesus would do and ask some serious questions. People invoke Christ for all sorts of purposes. But what I want to look at first is which, if any of them, are the purposes that Jesus himself would assent to, and which would he ultimately reject. The mainstream scholarly consensus, held by both believers and non-believers, is that Jesus of Nazareth was a Galilean Jew living in Roman-occupied Palestine in the early 1st century CE. He was not born into the ruling class. He was a craftsman's son from a provincial backwater, the kind of place that cosmopolitan Romans and Jewish elites alike would have looked down on, if they bothered to look at places like that at all. Nazareth was not on any major trade route. It was, in the language of the time, nowhere. Jesus was from nowhere. He emerged as a teacher and a prophet, proclaiming the coming of the kingdom of God, a radical social and spiritual transformation in which the existing order would be overturned. And this kingdom profiting business wasn't really his invention at all. There were many others before him and after him, but the doctrines held some common themes. The last would be first, the hungry would be fed, the powerful would be brought low, were the messages of the faith that Jesus was promoting. Now, these are not comfortable messages for people in comfort. The well-off, the conservative people, the top of the pyramid types, the elites. The message here was addressed primarily to the poor, to the sick, to the dispossessed, and to the socially marginalized. The people who had the most to gain from establishing a new order and the least to lose by imagining one. Jesus, you could say, was speaking to the "let's make Israel great again" crowd, and really all of the colonized inhabitants of Roman conquest. Jesus' harshest words were not reserved for sinners, whom he tended to sympathize with. They were for the religiously powerful, for the Pharisees who performed piety for public approval, for the scribes who tied up heavy burdens and laid them on people's shoulders, but will not lift a finger to move them, for the money changers operating in the temple, who turned a house of prayer into a marketplace in order to enrich themselves. The target of Jesus' prophetic anger, then, consistently and unmistakably, was the use of religious authority to maintain power and extract wealth from vulnerable and simple people. He wasn't going after prostitutes or even tax collectors. He was eating dinner with those people. He was going after the people who used God's name to keep themselves in power. And I bet that sounds familiar to most of us today. Eventually, his rebel rousing caught up with him, right? And he was executed by the Roman state at the request of the Jerusalem religious establishment. He was treated as a political threat. Crucifixion was Rome's method for simply dealing with sedition. It was meant to serve both as a punishment and as a warning to other people. Whatever else you believe about what happened after that, and that is a matter of faith and not one of history, the historical record is pretty clear about who killed him and why they did it. It wasn't the Jews, but it was the wealthy and well-established religious elites among the Jews and the Romans. Jesus was inconvenient for power, and so power does what it always does with people like that. It removed him. Okay, but where is all of this in Jesus' message? Can we find it somewhere? Yes, we can. It's in the Gospels of Matthew, chapters 5 through 7, which gives us the famous Sermon on the Mount. This is the most sustained and coherent ethical teachings in all of the Gospels. It's the closest thing we have to Jesus sitting down and simply telling us systematically what he thinks we need to do to live a good life. If you want to know what Jesus taught, this is probably the best place for you to go. You can go read it for yourself. It only takes about 15 minutes. But if you do, what you'll notice, at least if you approach it without a filter, is that Jesus was teaching basically two things. how you treat other people, especially the vulnerable, and the danger of performing religion for social approval. That is, going through the ritual and dogma of being a good religious person, but only so that you can gain access to power or money or care or love or acceptance from your community, or maybe something else that these people are going to withhold from you unless you prove yourself to be a loyal member by going through these motions. It is not primarily about sexual ethics. It's certainly not about doctrinal purity. And it's not about who is saved and who is damned. It's about the texture of daily moral life. And in that sense, it's pretty radical. The sermon begins with the Beatitudes, 8 blessings that systematically invert every value the surrounding Roman Jewish culture really held dear. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness. If you look closely, there's a lot of things that aren't on that list, namely wealth, power, military might, political advantage, victory, celebrity. None of those people, none of the winners in society are the ones who get called blessed. The Beatitudes don't say, blessed are the winners, blessed are the strong, blessed are the well-connected, blessed are the people whom the world recognizes as winners. It says, in fact, just the opposite. They say the measure of blessedness, of being right in a right kind of relationship with the kingdom of God, runs precisely counter to what the world ultimately rewards. It might as well say, wretched are the rich, miserable are the successful, out of touch are the ambitious, worthless are the famous. So this is an inversion of basic pagan values. Nietzsche is going to point this out, right? That these basic pagan values, the things that we generally think make us important and strong and, worthy of other people's admiration, are actually bad for us. That is Jesus's move here. He is inverting all of them. He's turning them all around. So if you believe in making money and being famous and being an important person, an influencer, let's say, if you believe in being celebrated in all these ways, you're really more of a pagan than you are a Christian, at least in your religious and ethical beliefs. The sermon then turns directly to the thing that Jesus seems to find the most repellent. Using religious authority as a performance for social approval and personal prosperity. Let's look at Matthew 6, verses 1 and 2. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others, to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. He says the same thing about praying. Don't pray on the street corners so that everyone can see you. You don't go onto TV and pray so that the masses can see you holding your cross and praying out loud. You go into your bedroom and you shut the door. And about fasting, don't make your face look somber so that others will notice. The entire thrust, then, of this section is the person who performs their religious devotion in order to be recognized socially as a member of the faith has already gotten their reward. They got the recognition, the praise from others. And that is all they are going to get. They are not going to be admitted into the kingdom of heaven. The God Jesus is describing will not be impressed by such a performance. God is paying attention to what is actually in your heart. What are you actually doing for other people? Not what you look like or the way you act or the way you say things. You can get rich by performing your religion to the right community. Give your money unto me and I will make you rich. I will get you in good with God. That person's already got their reward. They have a business model that is Christianity. The actual Christians, on the other hand, can't go with that because it violates the tenets of Jesus Christ himself. So this is, in the precise theological sense, the definition of performative Christianity. Jesus named it himself. He condemned it. He described it as a form of hypocrisy. This is not a minor failing. This is not failing to go to church on Sunday or something like that. This is a major violation of the very heart of what Christianity is supposed to be. The central example of what getting Jesus' religion wrong looks like. Later on in the sermon, Jesus addresses wealth directly, and I think he's pretty unambiguous about it. Matthew 6:24 says, "You can't serve both God and money." He doesn't say it's difficult to serve both God and money, nor does he say, be careful about how much you love your money. It could diminish your faith. He says you can only love one of these things. If you love your money, then you cannot love God. These are two different masters, and you will have to follow the one or the other. There is no third option. The word that gets translated here as money is the Aramaic mammon, a term for accumulated wealth, treated as a source of security and power. So don't think of the change that you might need to earn your daily bread here as following money. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about here is trying to be rich, trying to be wealthy, trying to accumulate more than you absolutely need. The sermon concludes with the famous golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, followed by the warning that those who hear these words and do not take them to heart enough to act on them at least are like a man who builds his house on sand. The measure of Christian authenticity, for Jesus anyway, is not what you believe about him. It's what you're going to do in his name. It's following the message that he's teaching, not devoting yourself to him. And that's important. It's important to understand that what Jesus is after here is trying to get people to act in the way that he's telling them to act, not simply to say, well, I'm a follower of Christ, so now I can do whatever I want. But this distinction really comes from somewhere. This idea of the difference between whether being Christian means following the message of Christ or whether it just means believing in the man and surrendering to the authority of Christianity. And where that historically has come about was relatively early on. We can look at a difference between the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of Paul, and we can see that that distinction is going to change everything. Now, this is a distinction that many Bible scholars routinely make, but it rarely makes it into public conversation about Christianity and among Christians. Again, I'm not trying to be hostile or anti-Christian on this point. You know, if you're a believer in the doctrine that it's simply a matter of giving yourself over to Christ and surrendering to Christ versus following Christ's message, I'm not trying to attack either side here. I'm trying to point out that there's a difference between these two things and that they have long existed within Christianity itself. This is a textual observation, and it has pretty significant implications then for the way you think about Christianity and what you think Christianity is supposed to do. Paul of Tarsus was one of the earliest Christians whose writings survive to today. His letters predate the Gospels by almost a decade. Now, he never met Jesus Christ during Jesus' lifetime, and so was not exactly primary source for what Jesus was saying and what Jesus was about. And by his own account, his knowledge of Jesus came more through revelation than through contact with the Jerusalem community that was already close to Jesus. But still, he's a towering intellectual figure within the church and the Bible. Without Paul, there's no systemic Christian theology. But again, Paul's emphases here are going to be different from those of Jesus. And the differences really matter. Jesus preached about the kingdom of God. It's a transformed social and spiritual order characterized by justice for the poor, care for the sick, the overthrowing of corrupt power, so on and so forth. It's a revolution that's going to enrich the lives of every citizen and bring about a whole new world order. Christ's primary question was really, how do you live in the light of the coming of this new world order, in the coming of the kingdom of heaven? His answer was, of course, what I was saying in the Sermon of the Mount. You have to already start enacting this. Once we start enacting it, when everybody's enacting it, then we will have achieved the kingdom of heaven. Paul, on the other hand, preached about Jesus himself, specifically about the significance of his death and his resurrection as a mechanism of salvation. The central Pauline question, then, is not how do you live and what is the message of Christ trying to teach us, but have you been saved through Christ? And the answer, he emphasizes, is faith. Faith in the atoning death and the resurrection of Christ as Lord and Savior. Do you agree with that? Do you buy into that? Do you have faith in it? If so, then you have been saved and your soul is going to heaven. You will partake in the kingdom of heaven, kind of no matter what. These are then related emphases, certainly not contradictory emphasis. And, serious Pauline scholars would argue that the continuity is maybe deeper than the way it appears as I'm getting it right here. But in practice, the selective readings of Christ that Paul tends to give us tend to dominate American evangelical culture today. And they take Paul's theology of salvation and his cultural conservatism and largely ignore what Jesus was actually saying about things like money and power and the treatment of the poor. The kingdom is gone, and paganism floods back into this version of Christianity and allows it to thrive as long as you're already saved through Jesus Christ, of course. The result then is a kind of Christianity that is preoccupied with correct beliefs, with sexual purity, and the question of who has been saved. And it draws itself almost entirely from Paul's letters, especially Romans, Galatians, and the pastoral epistles. The Sermon on the Mount, which says virtually nothing about any of those things, gets mentioned maybe at Easter, kind of as a footnote, and then is promptly set aside for the rest of the year. And what we're left with then is what I would call a selective Pauline version of Christianity. Paul has been mined through for boundaries and emphasis on salvation, and Jesus himself kind of takes a back seat. Jesus largely gets ignored for his ethics and his justice. Now, I'm not saying that Paul is wrong or that he twisted Christianity somehow. It's more that Paul, without the Sermon on the Mount, is a theology of being saved without a theology of how you're supposed to live a moral life. And that is a very convenient kind of religion for people who want the promises of heaven without any of the demands that kingdom is going to make upon them. It's a religion without any kind of responsibility. Or another way to think of it is maybe as a faith without any kind of conscience. And I think that is incredibly dangerous. It is incredibly dangerous to divorce the moral responsibilities, the ways people have to act and behave and the things that they have to do from whether or not they are a good person or not. because that is essentially what is happening here. Under the Pauline version of Christianity, this specific American evangelical version, you can in fact become a good person, a morally upstanding person, while doing some of the worst things, behaving in all the worst ways. Pedophilia tends to run rampant in some of these churches. And the reason that this sexual predation of children is tolerated is because those people are already saved. They're already good people. They just, shouldn't be doing those things. The collection of vast wealth in these churches is unprecedented in everything except for old school Catholicism. But it's that idea of like they're gathering all the wealth and the power and all of the things that Jesus railed against unto themselves, but it's okay because they're saved through Christ. What we've done then is divorce goodness, moral goodness, from the morality itself, from the behaviors that require something of you. And now you are free to do what you will, as you will, as long as it's not too embarrassing for the people in power, and still be a good Christian, thought of as a good Christian. It's almost exactly what Christ was complaining about with the Pharisees, that these people of high religious order are not actually adhering to what they're supposed to do. Instead, they are enriching themselves. They're helping themselves to all of the rewards of worldly life, and they don't deserve heaven. There's certainly more to say about this, and I think I'm going to actually make this a 2-part episode and extend what I'm saying here. But to sort of summarize what we've been talking about here is that there seems to be a disconnect between the teachings of Christ and what a lot of Christians actually do and say and believe. And yet there is a kind of continuity. There is a way to think about Christianity through the Christian Bible, especially emphasizing Paul's message, that allows a person to divorce their moral responsibilities from their moral status. And that is largely what I see happening in American Christianity today. Thanks for tuning in to American Socrates. If today's episode of philosophy got you thinking in new ways, make sure to subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. New, full episodes drop every Wednesday. If you enjoyed the show, leave a review. It helps others find us, and it means a lot. And if you know someone who could use a little more practical wisdom in their life, share this episode with them. Until next time, keep questioning everything.